Hey, everybody. Good morning. It is March 24th, 10 a.m. Eastern, and thank you all so much for joining me for so many of my recent live streams. I feel like I've been inundated with just so many people jumping in and sharing and commenting. It's been such an encouragement. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate you. And for anyone that's joining the live stream later as the replay, appreciate that just as much. Appreciate you checking out what we did and talked about. It really does mean the world to me. So I've been going through a series on my story and just touching on different aspects of it very slowly, not necessarily methodically, but just kind of meandering through the topic and seeing what comes to the surface and what topics end up sort of bubbling up. Not quite stream of consciousness, but just sort of diving into a few things and then seeing where it goes from there. But today, what I'm going to talk about is the topic of shame as a child, especially, but shame throughout my time as a Christian. So let's give it a second here before we dive in deeply and see what comes of the topic. I do think some of the things I'm going to share are just obvious, and it's going to be more like, yeah, we know this stuff. This is sort of part and parcel of what we always deal with. But I'm going to try really hard to bring out some insights and just certainly some parts of my aspects of my journey that just really hopefully will not necessarily encourage you that I went through it, but encourage you that there's hope that you can go through this stuff and come out the other side. So again, we're talking today about shame. And hey, thank you so much. Harper C says, hi, Tim, was just listening to part 10 and here you are with 11. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your doing the listening to the replay. Accidentally Agnostics in the building. Thank you so much. Great to see you here as always. So talking today very generically about shame, and I'll be digging into some of my stories with that. But I was thinking about just the ways that kids and teenagers as in Christian homes really can be just flooded with shame. I mean, really flooded with shame. And again, I'm just going to go through some ideas and then go through some ways that I think a little bit more specifically that it comes out. So in terms of just going real broad at first, real broad strokes, I think a lot of Christian kids are inundated with the shame of just being sort of theologically a sinner. You know, you're learning that you are actively doing things with your thoughts and your emotions that are upsetting God, but more fundamentally, even if you weren't doing something right now or today currently to upset God, you just should be ashamed because you are already wicked and offensive to God. You do have active private thoughts that are sinful or dangerous or rebellious, impure, certainly not keeping God front and center. And you need to repent of those because you are aware of them. You just thought a thought that wasn't right. But even if you sort of have a clean slate where you like, no, I've confessed all the sins I can think of, you're still just shameful because you are effectively a child of the world. You're a child of God in the biggest sense, but you're a child of the world, a child of sin. And your parents were sinners. You're sinners. You're ultimately traced back to Adam and Eve. You should have a lot to be ashamed of. And when you add in your current thoughts that you can say, yeah, I messed up today, and you can add in the presumptuous thoughts, you can add in things that you think I probably did some sin that I can rack my brain for it. I can't remember what I did, but I'm sure there's more out there where I either actively or passively, the sins of commission and omission, did something or I failed to do something. You should be ashamed of yourself. And I think a lot of us got that wrapped up with our emotions, where even something like anger could be seen as upsetting God. Sadness, where's the joy of the Lord? Your sadness could be a form of rebellion. Jealousy, certainly fear, frustrations, disappointments. All these things can come out as moral failures, and you don't think of it as this is just normal human experience. This is normal human growth even. These are all ways in which you think, man, oh man, I'm failing, I'm messing up, I'm giving God far less than he deserves. He is the king, and he deserves my honor and respect and obedience, and I'm treating him like he's just another poor guy on the street. I think a lot of us, this comes out, and I'll talk about this in more detail soon, but the idea of your body, of course, your body is framed as a source of temptation, of weakness, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, the fleshliness, the impurity, and that comes out even further when the sexual curiosity comes into play. Just normal childhood, adolescent curiosity becomes a part of your personal shame culture. Anytime that you're thinking about sex, or you're just thinking even about basic anatomy, you certainly, if you're feeling aroused or thinking about arousal, any kind of desire, anything like that, you feel alarmed at yourself. You feel perhaps disgusted. You feel dirty. You feel panicked. And when you're in a context where talking about physical stuff like sex and arousal and attraction is all framed as lust, of course, but when there's no real basic understanding, like in many Christian homes, sex education is really not a thing. It's like you'll figure it out when you get married. You'll figure out how everything works together. But there's no sense of like, let's just talk about it openly. And of course, that gets on to a higher level. Once masturbation comes into the equation, you certainly feel guilty, dirty, exposed, compromised, broken over something that, again, it's just totally common. Masturbation is completely common as a human experience. Nothing wrong with it. No reason for shame or being upset or dirty. In many ways, really should be seen as a form of celebration that this is amazing how this works. But it's not. It's shame. And again, I'll probably come back to some topics related to sexuality later to in this topic, or we may just do a whole series on sexuality at some point. But the intellectual curiosity stuff and the doubts becomes a big issue, where you're not just dealing with sex and the body, you're dealing with all these arenas of your thought life. And for Christians who are very serious about the Lord, if you have any part of you that's thinking, I'm confused, or I'm doubting, or I feel like I'm not really thinking God's thoughts after him, and that's really what it was about. Are you thinking God's thoughts after him? And for a lot of us, that really just becomes almost a bigger issue. Like, for me, sexuality was a piece of it, but I was really caught up much more in, am I thinking God's thoughts after him? Am I really being a person of faith, or is it, and trust, or is this some kind of rebellion that's happening? Are you hard-hearted, or are you open and pliable to the things of the Lord and to the Spirit? And that can come out even in basic things like intellectual curiosity. You're learning about science or evolution or history, and a lot of that can be seen as shameful or threatening to your walk with God, because it's not being done through a Christian lens. You want to read only the Christian history books, not the secular history books. Even something like Encyclopedia Britannica can be somewhat threatening and shameful, because you're not seeing God woven into all the things that you're reading there. Of course, anytime you actively disobey as a child, that gets so much shame, because you feel like you're rebelling against your parents, but ultimately against God, because God put them there. And I remember one time I directly disobeyed my mom. I was upstairs and looking out the window. It was the summertime, so it was a screen. And I looked out. She was outside doing something, and I called her by her first name instead of saying mom. And I knew that was wrong. I knew that the rule was you call her mom. You don't call her by her first name as a kid. And I did it once, and she looked up at me and said, Tim, don't do that. And I directly did it again. And of course, I got very, very severely spanked for it. She raced upstairs and made sure that was put to bed. But looking back at it, I have no idea where that came from. That wasn't typical of me. It wasn't the sort of thing I would usually do. But it became a big piece of my shame. Lots. And anytime I did that, I remember one time I pulled out the chair. You can, like, if your sibling is about to sit down, you pull out the chair at the last minute and they don't notice it, and then they fall on the floor. I did that once to one of my siblings, and it really hurt them. They went away and cried for a while, and I felt guilt and shame over that. And I'm not saying I shouldn't have. That was a really good reason to be shameful, to hurt someone like that. But we were little and we were always playing pranks on each other, and I just thought they would laugh, and they didn't. But a lot of these things add up to not just that one incident where you think, okay, you did something wrong. Now you've said, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I won't do it again. You've made it right. You've made it right with them and God. But it in the context of the theology, it's not really ever done. It's just, that's another example of something that's kind of written in the book. It's written, that's on your permanent record. It's there. And you always feel like, even though it's forgiven in a sense, it could be pulled out, someday as an example of why you weren't always loving. And I think I always carried with me that sense that God does keep a record of wrongs. I know that 1 Corinthians 13 notwithstanding, um, he has a book. Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, for every idle word that you speak, you will give an account. Every idle word, you will give an account. And the idea that the books will be opened someday and you'll be judged. I always felt like forgiveness was there, but forgiveness was also, um, it was sort of promised, but not promised. It was like, we'll never bring these things up as far as the east is from the west. So that's how far he's removed your transgressions from you. And yet he's got a book where he's writing down every idle word that you speak. And that conundrum, to me personally, brought a lot of shame. And I think I personally just have a personality that leads towards shame more easily, perhaps a more sensitive spirit, you might say. But in that sensitive spirit, the shame becomes much more of a deeper issue. I think on that note, sometimes our personality traits were part of our shame, where maybe you were too loud one day, or too shy, you're too intense, you're too sensitive, you're too silly, you're too independent, on it goes. And in some contexts that worked fine. Other contexts you got reprimanded for it, especially if it was like an example of how you had a strong will, a rebellious spirit. And for me, I think when I got ever reprimanded for having a personality trait that was too much in a certain context, it may have been a legitimate need for my parents or the authority to speak up and rebuke me. But again, as a sensitive person, you take that very deeply, you take that very personally. Those are the kind of things for which you feel deep shame. And again, when you have a context that says every time you mess up, you're forgiven, the cross is there, but it's in a book. It's never really done. And I believed it. I was not like, well, it'll be okay, it'll work out in the end. Like, no, it may not. Like, God is keeping score. And I think it's fascinating how a lot of us notice and comment on the fact that when we look at Christian teachings on forgiveness and on God's unconditional love, that it's often framed as both unconditional, and yet there's so much verbiage about how it's very conditional. And that hurts. That hurts a lot. The conditional nature of God's love and kindness and forgiveness is often just a total mixed bag. I think a lot of us certainly have the shame of our appearance and modesty, especially for girls, I think much more than boys. But, if your clothes weren't right, if your body was developing and there was a reason, if you were particularly attractive, that became loaded with shame and even blame for a lot of people. I noticed that in other people, not as much for me. I certainly didn't feel like some attractive guy or anybody that anybody was thinking about behind the scenes. I was just sort of average to my own expectations, my own thought process. But I knew people that talked about it or felt that way, and you could just sense the vibe that these people feel ashamed just for being like they literally did nothing. They could have just stood there, and there's like an inherent shame. Again, certainly when you have all that and you have the context of the backdrop of your original sin and your active sins, you end up getting more specifically into the shame of the salvation question of, are you really saved? And that sort of went on steroids for me. I like that expression, but it kind of went on steroids for me because when I was a young teenager or preteen, I was listening to John MacArthur all the time as he was going through a series called The Gospel According to Jesus, which is another title for the series about lordship salvation. And the point of that was to say that you don't get to accept Jesus as Savior and not accept him also as Lord or King or Master. You don't get to slice and dice Jesus up and say, I know he's Savior and he's also King, he's also the Lord of my life, but I'm only going to take a third or a quarter of Christ. No, you either take him all or you don't take him at all. And so anytime you would sin, you would have this fear of what if it's possible that I've done that? I've taken him as Savior. I've gotten my get out of jail free card. I've got my fire escape plan, but I haven't actually accepted Christ. I just like the idea of going to a happy place and avoiding a sad place, but I want heaven, but I don't really want Christ. I don't want holiness. So sin ends up making you feel that shame, and that comes out of areas as well, like not just sin, but your prayer life. Maybe you don't feel like you're really doing well at that as a Christian. You feel like you're distracted and bored and inconsistent. Maybe you just feel like you should be moved. You hear people praying these deep prayers. Oh God, please this and please that, and you're like, wow, they're really feeling it. And when I pray, I'm just going through the motions. It feels like, even though it means a lot to me in one sense, I feel like I'm not feeling anything. And I'll still do it because it's important, but it's more like a task as opposed to a conversation with the King of the universe and with the lover of your soul. And that plays out in Bible reading, other spiritual disciplines. If you're not doing your devotions, you're not enthusiastic all the time about going to church, like, you know what? I'll go, but I really don't want to this week. I'm like, well, why? These are the people of God. Or maybe you're not memorizing scripture enough. You're not evangelizing enough. Maybe worship feels sort of, I'm worshiping, but it's like I could kind of take it or leave it. And it definitely doesn't feel like I'm feeling the Spirit moving as I worship. And yet you feel like you should. And all these things come together. If you have any sense, and this was a big deal for me, if you have any sense that you're just as equally associated with the world, your social belonging, your club, your people are just as much the people outside of church as inside, you're kind of straddling the fence. It feels like you're with worldly people as much as with Christian people, and you don't really feel a difference. Then, and you want the acceptance maybe from your worldly peers, then you feel that shame of like, I'm not really fitting in the Christian mold. And I know we would always say at this point the Christian mold was, not at all healthy, nothing to admire and want to pursue. But at that time, you do want to fit into it. You want to fit into it very much. You want people to say, this is a person who has absolutely done everything they can to step into the role that God has invited for them, both in terms of holiness as well as ministry. And that expands, of course, into your family's reputation. Is there any shame of what my family is like? Does my family look godly enough? Are we obedient? Are we making our Christian parents look good? Are we pure enough? Are we watching shows where, like, if the other people knew, no one knows what we're watching on TV, but if they knew that we're watching this, like even something as simple as that, those stupid wrestling shows where, it's got nothing to do with anything. It's just people acting like they're really wrestling, and they're being silly, and I'm sure some of it really did hurt to do, but it's also a lot of it's acting. They're punching each other in the face, and you kind of get the sense that behind the scenes they're probably barely touching each other, but they've learned how to respond, and they're jumping off the ropes and all that. The World Wrestling Federation stuff, Hulk Hogan kind of stuff. I used to love that as a kid, and I felt deeply ashamed because that has nothing to do with God. And I thought you shouldn't be. It isn't like pure sin, but you just shouldn't be liking this so much. But it was just the thing to do for, a short period of time. I didn't like it long. It got, boring, and you could kind of tell the fakeness of it. But for a year or two, I was like, I want to do that. And even things as benign as like watching Tom and Jerry or, some kind of comedy, if it didn't mention Christ, it was in a sense upsetting to my spirit, because it wasn't necessarily pure shame, but it was the passive shame of this doesn't actively bring any glory to Christ or to the church or the gospel. And you end up having this deep identity wound far down inside, and I've certainly had it, where it isn't just that you're ashamed of a particular action that you did or failed to do, or a particular word you said and conversation you had or didn't have. The shame really starts to get in you. It wraps around your identity. It's not that thing I did is bad, or that thing I thought was dirty. It's, I am bad. I am dirty. I am unworthy. I am broken. I am unsafe. I'm not bringing glory to God. I'm not exemplifying the gospel. I'm not, like, this day passed and I made zero contributions to the kingdom. And there's this brutal reality it's in there, that Christian kids are taught to experience ordinary life, ordinary development and growth and change and awareness, self-awareness and awareness of the world. You're taught to experience all this development through the lens of like a courtroom judge, like you're being judged and they can see your actions and your thoughts, your words. It's being recorded. It's going to be judged. And from the earliest days, you're in trouble. You're in the hot seat and everyone's looking at you and saying, what's wrong with you? Why can't you buck up? Why can't you get in line? Why can't you do the right thing? And that hurts. That really hurts. And when you look into, that going on for years and you get to the teenage years where you're hitting puberty, you're starting to be attracted to people. Teenagers are starting to feel like they're contaminated, and you should just feel like you're developing, but you're feeling contaminated. And again, masturbation maybe becomes part of that. You feel like there's this secret double life where you're like, that stuff is irrelevant to me, but secretly it's very important to me. You feel like you're filthy, really. You have all this evidence that your heart really is corrupt. And of course, you can get very specifically into things like sexual ethics. And the language of like you're permanently stained, you're chewed up bubble gum, or you're a rose with the petals half gone. And again, some of that didn't affect me. Losing my virginity was, whether I wanted it or not, it wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't part of my world. But for a lot of people, it is, and I could see how people could be constantly on that fence of like, did I go too far? Did I do this? Did I mess up permanently? And there was language of, oh, you can have a second virginity, but we all knew. I remember when I was younger, there was this girl that stood up in church one night, and it didn't take the whole service, but it was a good 5 or 10 minutes before the service really kind of got back to the sermon and the songs. But she stood up, and I'm just guessing, I was very young when this happened, but I'm just guessing she was probably between 13 and 14, 15 years old, somewhere in there. And she had gotten pregnant with her boyfriend, and he wasn't there. I don't know his story, but she got up in front of the whole church and apologized for having been sexually active and now having a baby. She, of course, vowed to do the right thing and to, have this baby and to love it, and asked for the church to support her as a woman that wanted to now be a woman that lived for Christ, to certainly be no longer sexually active until she got married. And she just apologized in tears to the whole church. And as much as that was her story, not mine, her shame, as a young child, not even really knowing what sex was, I understood that this sex thing is powerful. And there's a lot of shame involved if you mess this up. I mean, it's sort of like, holding a bunch of firecrackers in your hand. If you're safe and you do this right, you're probably okay. But if you mess around, you do occasionally hear those stories of, oh, that teenager was messing around with firecrackers on the 4th of July and decided to be so much fun to light it and hold it in his hand and see what happens. And he blew a finger off. And you're like, there's some serious stuff that happens if you mess this up. This is dynamite. In the right context, it'll do the right job and it'll be a good thing. In the wrong context, it'll destroy you. And again, I didn't have it in the sense of being sexually active. I didn't want to, but even if I'd wanted to, my world just wasn't, it wasn't like there was open doors. There were no girls inviting me anywhere to do stuff. It just wasn't part of my options. But, you still go to different places in your mind. You still feel the shame of it. And you certainly feel the shame of attraction. If you just notice someone, you notice someone's beauty or curves, and you have even a shred of a hint of fantasizing or having a crush that has a sexual tone to it, you feel that chemistry. That is so intensely shameful for a lot of us. And then, of course, modesty culture, versus both in terms of people that are focused on being modest, but also those of us who are more, from my experience as a guy, modesty culture wasn't as big a deal for what I needed to wear or not wear, but just noticing other girls, and you feel like you need to support modesty culture, and yet you're really like seeing skin too. Is in my mind, like I love it when a girl wears a beautiful low cut, sundress. I'm like, but that's not, you shouldn't like seeing that. And it just, that shame just went so deep, so deep, just normal stuff that you should think this is just beautiful. But any kind of romantic longing that had any sense of sexuality, certainly if you were wanting, even in your head and thinking, even in marriage, someday I can't wait to be affectionate and kissing and having this emotional and physical intimacy, all these desires, if they're premature, where it's like that is a good desire, that's perfect, but it's for marriage. If you're thinking about it too early, that becomes, again, very spiritually risky, because you're turning something into an idol. Your focus is not on God and on purity; it's on that person and their body. I do think that teenage years often also become a time for a lot of us to start questioning stuff. This was not part of my journey for the most part, as far as I know, but I do get the sense that from other teenagers that some of them begin to develop some skepticism. That's natural mental development, but some of them get framed as like being rebellious or backsliding or some kind of spiritual decay. And I didn't, again, experience that. I was on the, I'm on fire for God kind of stuff. And, I'm up front being a leader, but I could see it in other people where they didn't necessarily, they were glad to come to youth group, but they didn't necessarily want to just be on fire for God all the time. It was sort of it felt like, when I observed it, like they kind of had one foot in the church and one foot in the world. And that, a lot of people get shamed from that. I'm just noticing a few comments I missed here. I was looking at some notes, but Harper C says, I'm in Australia, so I don't always make it to the lives. I'm so glad it worked out. So glad it worked out. I appreciate it if you're still here. Thanks for being part of our family. And I'm trying to do a lot of different times throughout the day. So hopefully it's easier to, see at least one, certainly to watch the replays, but to see at least one live a day. There will be some days, even starting next week, where I'll be literally on live streaming about 4 to 5 times a day. So I'm doing what I can. Ale the Infidels, it's great to see you here. Newbie and Bro, it's like you can never please him. Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. You can never please him. And Alex, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Henry, thank you so much. And just so glad you all are here. Appreciate it. And again, for anyone that's joining the live stream late or watching the replay, appreciate you as well. I think I'll come back to some comments if they more come in, but just want to read a few more of my thoughts about this. I think a lot of people had mental health struggles. I thought I probably didn't at the time, and I felt bad for people that I thought did, but looking back on it, I did and didn't know it. Number one, it's pretty obvious I had some kind of spiritual OCD. I certainly had some episodes of spiritual depression and anxiety. Am I doing enough for God? I certainly had the mental health concern of self-hatred all the time. I literally hated myself all the time. And I felt like even when there wasn't anything at all on the table, like you did something wrong and they're going to find out, like nothing like that. It was just, but as if you had done something wrong. That's how it felt. It felt like they are going to find out. Like, I'm like, well, what are they going to find out? There's nothing to find out. Like, I'm just a normal teenager, but I felt like it. I felt like I was always on the fence, always on the verge of being exposed. And I think you go through seasons of feeling like you're fine, but then you're going to be exposed. You're not, you're ashamed. And that can lead to some things like numbness, again, depression. And that perpetuates the cycle where you're now suffering or sad or just really not experiencing the joy of the Lord. And you're ashamed of that because it reflects a sense of your poor faith or your poor commitment to the Lord. On that note, a lot of us, I think, felt that any worldly interest that popped up, such as music and movies or social trends, maybe some people it was fashion. I wasn't very fashionable, so that wasn't my struggle. But maybe it's fashion. Certainly now internet culture stuff, even things like books or humor or different groups of friends and cliques. All these things can become arenas where people feel very ashamed. I would say for me, the biggest ones were music and movies. I got to at one point where I got really convicted that I should get rid of any worldly music. And it wasn't like hardcore stuff for the most part. It was like Phil Collins and Heart had some harder songs, but not too bad. It wasn't like I was listening to Led Zeppelin or Def Leppard all the time. It was more just like, classic 70s rock, early 80s rock, and Phil Collins, Billy Joel, stuff that now you're like, that is about as benign as it gets. But at the time, it wasn't directly giving honor and glory to Christ and to the gospel. So I felt shame that I had a few of those. And I felt shame about watching movies I felt shame both in two senses. Number one, if the movie didn't honor God, or number two, it had anything about sexuality, even like a joke or a hint. But also just any sense of you're spending too much time at this. I mean, even if it was literally watching TV that was honoring to God, if you're watching too much of it, that itself is an issue because you're not out there connecting to people, sharing the gospel, being an example. So on that note, I would say I felt a lot of shame from wanting my peers in church and my leaders in church, the youth pastor, the elders, the other families. I wanted to be really boldly standing apart from, I mean, just like head and shoulders. And the weird thing for me is that I did stand head and shoulders above most of my teenage peers. I was always involved in ministry. I had memorized thousands of verses. I was reading systematic theologies well into my teenage years on purpose, actively, voluntarily, gladly. I was reading devotional books just nonstop and listening to Christian radio on purpose. I did stand head and shoulders, and I had no reason to be thinking you have anything to be ashamed of. You are literally like a young leader. You are shockingly mature for your age. And I still felt incredible shame. And I don't quite know why. I just felt like even though there was no secret sins in that sense, I felt like there was. And I think that's part of this is you just your body and your mind make it real. They make the shame feel real. You have this pressure to represent Christ at all times, again, to protect your family image, your church image, to avoid any hint of a scandal. I mean, I didn't think there was any scandals that could come close to me, like, divorce and abortion and all that. It just wasn't part of my options. But your teenage years and young adulthood can feel like you are truly on a stage, and everyone is watching you, and there's a surveillance camera, certainly for the other people in your life, but more importantly for God. God is watching. The angels are watching. And this just comes out in so many ways, so many ways. Any spiritual inconsistency, I felt like I struggled a lot with the idea of the different kinds of worship where I would see people come into church, sometimes my church, but I was at least aware of other churches that did it differently, but they'd come in and they'd raise their hands. And I was very much in the midst of a sort of a storm of people pulling different directions with that, where some people saw that as too touchy-feely, but also too charismatic and not focused on the mental worship. It was more like, I want to feel an experience. I want to feel it. Like, well, that's not what this is about. This isn't about what you feel. This is about what you believe and about whether you're willing to let God transform your mind. He may or may not give you touchy-feely feelings. You may or may not feel warm fuzzies, but that's never been what this is about. So in terms of secret sins, I think that the only thing that really came to my life eventually was the idea of, what if thinking normal sexual thoughts is an example of how you're not serious enough about God? And I've talked about how I, for a while, used to try my best to imagine people on fire as if they were already in hell, but walking around. And you can't easily think, boy, she's beautiful and she's got curves, and wow, look at her walking around, and just, oh my gosh, she's so amazing. You can't really do that when you're thinking of them as burning in hell and screaming. No one's going to look at a burning victim and think, oh, sexy. You don't do that. You think, I need to help them escape, or I'm really sad that that's their outcome, that they ended up in hell. And so I protected my shame of thinking normal thoughts of not even directly sexual, just like, she's a really beautiful woman. Just a plain observation. Overwhelming shame. I had to stop it. I had to, because I would feel like that is evidence that you are lusting, you are cold to the things of the Lord, and you're ultimately spiritually defective and broken, and maybe you're not even saved. And so this whole idea of, managing your sin versus having a secret life, you end up in these cycles that we've all talked about probably too many times, but you kind of hide your sin, and then you feel guilty for hiding it, and you eventually confess it. You eventually make it right. You feel restored. You promise never to do it again. You're tempted. You eventually fail. You panic. You hide again, and it starts all over. And then you feel like it's worse, not just because you've sinned again, but now you feel like, am I really being honest with myself? Did I really mean the first confession? Because if I meant it, I wouldn't have done it again. But here I am doing it again. So we now have two problems, the sin and the dishonesty. And there were certainly things too where in the midst of that you would feel shame over spiritual parts of your journey, again, where you're not as much dealing with sexuality and so forth, but you can feel shame over not being sure what God wants or whether you're called to this ministry or that particular activity. And you really fear not doing God's perfect will. I remember many sermons that effectively talked about you need to pursue God's perfect will. But there is sort of a God's will plan A, God's will plan B, and God's will plan C. And God's will plan A is the best. God's will plan B is like, it's close, but you screwed it up a little bit, but you pulled it together. Plan C is like, God told you no over and over, and you just said, I'm going to do it anyway. And he basically said, I'll rescue you in the long run, but you pretty much messed up, and you're gonna have to take the fall for this. You did not really do it my way at all. You kept on being selfish and prideful, and that fear that you were anywhere on the, God's will plan B or C or worse, that scared the hell out of me. I wanted God's will, big picture and small details. I wanted to know that his calling was clear and that I was honoring that, and that I was not going to mess up his perfect will. Most importantly for marriage, but also for things like ministry and all the other stuff that he would want me to do. And so as you deal with this stuff, you have this sort of emerging self-image over all these years when the person you were trying to become and the person you reflect on that you've been up to that point, with the person you are and are trying to become, is just flooded with these messages that say, you're bad, you're wicked, you've fallen short, you're dangerous, you're deceptive, you're prideful, you're broken, you're not honoring to God, you are living a secret life. And what you really need from this point on is not for someone to say anything like, it's okay, you're doing fine, you're trying your best. What you need most at that point is to be crushed by God. And I remember directly praying that. Several of us in Bible college used to talk about this a lot, where we would actively, routinely pray, God, please do whatever it takes to make me holy, even if you have to crush me. If you need to make me a quadriplegic where nothing from my neck down works, and I spend my life in a wheelchair like Johnny Erickson Tata, if you need to follow her role, Johnny Erickson Tata was a big part of my thought process as a kid, because, and I didn't know that, when I read her story, I don't know, and if anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about, it's just a teenage girl who dove into a lake. It was much shallower than she thought. She hit a rock or something real hard, smashed her head into it. It snapped her neck. And from, age whatever, 15 on, she never had anything from her neck down that worked. So her body was basically in a wheelchair. And, the only thing that she could do is like move her mouth, and she could talk, and her voice was thankfully, spared from it, but everything else in her body was basically had to be taken care of by a machine or by a nurse or something. And it obviously, in a sense, ruined her life physically. But she turned it into something that was like God's will and made the best out of it. And I'm glad she did for her sake. I'm sad for her that it was mythology based, of course, but she did make a lot of beautiful choices. I mean, she literally used her working mouth to become a painter. She would have somebody literally move her wheelchair up to a place which she could have a brush in her mouth, and she could dab it into different paints and then paint on the canvas. And she had beautiful stuff. I mean, far, far, far beyond what I could do with, two hands and a working body. She did amazing art. And I don't know if she's still alive or not, but she was an example to me of us saying, God, if you need to do that to me, to capture my heart and to take me away from sin and to make my perspective fully wrapped up in you, then do it. I would rather be a quadriplegic than a sinner who has a body that works just fine. That was my prayer life. For years, we prayed like that. Do whatever it takes to crush us and make us holy. And of course, you'd want to kind of say to yourself, but even though I'm praying that, I'm not going to do it. God, God, please don't take it that far. I I will be careful. I will do what I'm supposed to. But there were days where you thought, I wonder if God's going to have to do something dramatic to take this shame that I already have, but to actually make it mean more to me, to be more painful. And that maybe if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. And so we would deal a lot with the crushing. In terms of just, I want to dive into a little bit more specifics on some of these. And we've been going for about 40 minutes. I'm going to read a few comments and then dive into a few deeper thoughts on this. But I think that some of this stuff is probably relatable to those of you who've been through it. So I hope it does help you to heal a little bit, to think through it with me. Nubian says, those preconditioned indoctrinations still affect me, though I no longer believe. Yeah, very much so. They went down to the worldview level for sure. Hey, Shannon, great to see you. If you're still here, I appreciate you joining for whatever you can. And we'll be doing another one tonight, 8 to 10 Eastern, if anyone wants to join then. But that'll be a call-in show, but I appreciate you all being here for the comments. I was condemned by the church for listening to jazz and other genres. It was clean music, but still deemed as the devil's music. It's unfortunate how they do this to people. Yeah, I was the same way for me. If it's got the wrong cadence or whatever, it's considered worldly music. Alex says, I was never taught about it, so I didn't really have shame as I was completely clueless. I mean, that's great. There are certainly people that escaped from some of the worst parts of the shame culture. And it's probably a very, very good thing. Deconstructing and reconstructing have been difficult for me. Yeah, it's very difficult to think through this because it just went so deep. And I think the first step is, though, just doing what we're doing here. We're talking about it, acknowledging it, expanding on it, elaborating on how it came in, how it took over, and what our minds did with it for all those years. You can't really fight it unless you at least have a starting place of saying this did happen. Watching and documenting everything you do, feel, etc. It was so psychologically and emotionally draining and traumatizing. Yeah, for sure, 100%. You can't do that because you're then told you have a spirit of lust. Yeah. Oh my God, Tim, you're spot on. I remember feeling all those things and at times still do, though I'm no longer a believer. Yeah, some of them lingers. The roots go so deep. I Hate God says, when God's will becomes lack of knowledge and the shortcomings of those around her, that you don't jump into shallow water. Terrible story. I know of such a bridge that a few have succumbed to. Yeah, it's very sad to think about how sometimes shame culture leads people to hate themselves and even to try to take themselves out or worse. In terms of going through again some more specific things, I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that I think about when I think about this topic is that this shame was really there from the earliest days before you could even understand it. Like, you could eventually talk about it and read verses about it, but the feelings were there when we were really little, because you would sense just the tone of the home or of the church. It was like the weather, our storm fronts coming in. You just feel it between the correction and the discipline, the spankings, the altar calls, the family devotions, Christian school messages, children's ministries, VBS. Certainly as a teenager, a lot of messages in Christian camp and so forth, saying, you're living for yourself, and this is time you're old enough to make a decision to live for Christ. And you should be ashamed. You're living in Laodicea. And you should be ashamed of yourself. And I think the point what I'm trying to make is that we do absorb tone very early on in life before we absorb the theology. We can feel the tension, the urgency, and the disappointment, the fear, the pressure, and that becomes our background. It becomes the wallpaper on the wall in our whole home. It's just always there. You're always guilty. And I think the invitation to us as we think through some of these is to say, when we're developing as children, that should be focused on normal development and discovering who you are. Who are you as a human? This is a time frame to say, I'm delightfully, gladly, joyfully, happily, all the good adjectives. I'm just delighting in learning about the world. I'm delighting in learning about the world and about myself. And instead, Christian shame starts from the earliest days by saying, what you need to focus on is not discovering who you are and what's out there in the world. You need to discover what's wrong with you. Your life in its best form begins the minute that you understand fully that you are really, really profoundly, disturbedly wrong. I mean, like, you are really, really wrong. You're on the wrong side of everything. You're on the wrong side of God. You're on the wrong side of truth. You're on the wrong side of purity. And if you can understand that and admit it, then we have something to work on here. We have a possibility of a future and a hope for you. But until you admit it, this is just going to get worse. This is like putting a Band-Aid on cancer. You're not dealing with the issue. And I think a lot of us really began to, in that context, have a self-talk, a self-monitoring that was pretty much all the time, where you would say, why did I do that? Was that pride? Was that selfishness? Was that self-centeredness? Was that rebellion? And you come up with these internal splits, these two conversations. I am deeply in love with the Lord. I'm deeply in love with his word. I'm deeply committed to being holy and useful to God. This other voice says, you're bad, 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 bad. That split creates the intense context where children are not psychologically safe. When your inner world, your thought life becomes, again, the courtroom, the interrogation room, all the time. God knows your heart. God sees your thoughts. He can read your mind. That can be terrifying to a kid. And even if you don't think about it too much or think, well, it's God, and yeah, he's watching, but he's also a God of love, so I'm good, I'm safe. Just knowing he's constantly monitoring you and he can read your thoughts. And you end up with, for many of us, I'm sure some kids just say, I just give up. I want to go sin. I like my ways, and I'll get serious about God later. But for a lot of us, it was not that. It grew into perfectionism, OCD, the whole, scrupulosity stuff. You just feel like, I cannot ever be safe. I have to look over my shoulder. And you're not looking over your shoulder for the devil. You're looking over your shoulder for yourself, for your sin, for your lack of commitment. And so if your mind, in a sense, is your personal room, you never can really live there. You cannot live and rest in your own room, because that's your own room. The room of your mind is the place that's also the courtroom. And every day you have to monitor your thoughts, your feelings, and your reactions. And you have to detect your hidden sins and your hidden motivations. Have to. There's no privacy. There's no privacy. Everything, your secret thoughts are fully searchable by God. And again, we talked about how that wraps up, brings into it things like normal curiosity or normal emotions, sadness or grief. Everything can become a form of ingratitude to God for the gospel. Again, how can you have a sad day when God, the God of the universe, bought you from sin and made you his own? If you don't have the joy of the Lord, the problem's not the Lord, the problem's you. And so sadness became a concern. Anything that became too arrogant or prideful or assertive became a form of, like, maybe it's defiance to God. And we needed attention. We needed comfort. We needed to ask good questions. But all of it became a way of saying, you cannot trust yourself. You cannot trust yourself. You really can't. I think a lot of us saw that too with sibling conflict. If any of us felt like, man, we fight with our siblings way too much, all that kind of stuff. There was all these ways in which our fallen nature was coming right to the surface and see. Christianity looks at normal human development and makes it a major issue. It's, in a word, pathologizing human development. And that is devastating to children. And yet Christianity sees that as a beautiful form of pride. Like, we're so proud that we are telling you from the earliest days that you're broken, because until you know you're broken, you don't know who's going to fix that. And the one who fixes it, of course, is your Savior. But you cannot appreciate the Savior. I cannot sell you the cure until you acknowledge you're diseased. And so you really confuse your identity with being guilty. You're wicked by nature. You're wicked by choice. That's your self-talk. Your self-talk, your inner voice is accusing you all the time. Your identity is bad, bad, bad. You feel fundamentally, profoundly, almost permanently stained. Your only hope at that point is that, God will someday heal your stain. He will take your stain away. But in the meantime, you're pretty much, you're in big danger. When a child can understand concepts like, or at least understand the tone and feeling of depravity and worthlessness, unworthiness, brokenness, that creates your self-talk, your self-concept. And it makes, and also I think it almost takes you away from considering a way of being compassionate to yourself. Because if you feel like you're excusing your sin, that's normal human development, or that's whatever, like that could be a form of you excusing your sin. And so when your shame comes in, it fuses with your identity. It's hard to grow as a human because you're trying constantly to just do damage control and repair things. And you're hating yourself on so many levels that everything is just like pure survival mode. And you may not see it on the outside, but on the inside, that's what's happening. Being good, or at least being seen as being good, is sort of, it's part performance, but it's also part survival. You want safety, you want approval, you want praise. I mean, I remember the feeling when I would go to Awana and I could say the verses and jump through the hoops and get the little, those little jewels that you put in a little plastic crown that goes on your Awana vest. I remember the pride that I felt, the adults just smiling with approval. Tim can say all these verses. He can say them blindfolded and backwards, upside down. And he can say them faster and quicker than anyone else. And he's always accurate. He doesn't make mistakes. What a great kid. I had some pride in that for sure. But then you look at the kid that struggles. Maybe they don't have as good of a memory, or maybe they come from a family where they're not getting enough sleep, or they're not eating right. And so memory issues are going to be more of an issue just because of those very surface issues. Any number of reasons, like they don't get the approval. And I remember thinking, I'm proud of myself, but I'm also like, I felt ashamed, ironically, that I was being compared to other people. Like I made other people look bad effectively as a kid. And you stitch all these things together, and it's just a mess. It's a mess upon mess. You learn how to perform the right tone, the right words, the right actions, the right facial expressions, smile, give the right Sunday school answers. Anything you can do to get that praise, that approval, to avoid the correction. Anything to avoid correction and to basically be seen as spiritually mature for your age. I remember being told so many times. It was almost ridiculous how many times I heard it. Tim is so spiritually mature for his age. He lives and acts and just has the whole vibe of a 30-year-old mature Christian at age 13. Like, how is this possible? He is so serious about God. It's all just part of this approval cycle. When you take it seriously and you really think you want that God, and you want the human approval as well as God's approval, if you happen to be OCD or a perfectionist, it's within your grasp to jump through those hoops and to get everyone's praise. And when you get it a few times, there's your dopamine hit, and you want to keep doing it. You want to keep feeling convicted, or at least look like that. Keep feeling grateful and worshipful and ministry minded, so that this expected script looks like it's real, and it becomes real. You make it real. And being praised for being spiritually mature is a trap. It's a trap that a lot of children fall into. You want to be seen as on fire for God. And if you do it a few times, you see the praise that you get, you see the awards, you see the clapping, and that's it. They trap you. That's the propaganda. That's the indoctrination. That's the mind control. And I think a lot of us acted very godly because we were simply adapting to the pressure to perform. And you're in that context, you have to admit now that you're on this side of it, you and I were put under pressure to be responsible for things that no child should have to feel. First and foremost, of course, your eternal destiny. It's all in your hands. Your parents can't become a Christian for you. They can become a Christian for themselves, but you have to pick Christ. You have to truly have faith. Your eternal destiny is in your hands. God's opinion of you for time and eternity is in your hands. Whether you truly repented and repented enough, whether you're pure enough, if you have selfish motivations or good motivations, if you have hidden sins or you're truly repenting and doing the right thing, those lists that we go through, those hoops are brutal for a child and for their psychology and their nervous system. All these invisible burdens that we had, it just this piling weight upon weight upon weight upon weight. And the idea, again, of eternity is just itself overwhelming. You're adding in judgment and hell and demonic influences. And, you better be sincere. You better mean it. God can see whether you mean it or not. You're just being crushed from the inside. Is your salvation really real? Is your prayer life real and sincere? Are you really deep in your thought process about your repentance and your commitment to the Lord? Your altar calls, are you doing them? Are you doing enough rededications? When you think about dying suddenly, are you afraid of that? Well, why? Why are you afraid to face God suddenly? Are you afraid that you have a secret sin that's going to put your whole life and eternity at risk? And so I think we should, admit children are not equipped developmentally to carry those terrors. I mean, these are metaphysical terrors. This moral absolutism perspective that's just pile it on. And that's on top of, school pressures to do your chores, pressures to all kinds of stuff, pressures from your peers to be cool and, be good at sports, all kinds of life pressures that are already there. But, you're responsible for your salvation, your commitment. You're responsible for other people's souls. You're responsible to evangelize. You should be concerned that your friends or family might go to hell. And you have literally given these children stakes that are cosmic. Like everything is in your hands, little children. Time and eternity, people's destinies of heaven or hell, I'm going to put them in your little teeny childhood hands. That's the shame is overwhelming. I remember my prayer life certainly became a place of endless self-examination. Again, did I confess enough? Am I praying for the lost enough? Did I mean it enough? Did I even pray long, like physically long enough? Is 20 minutes enough, or should it really be like an hour? God specifically says, or Jesus says in the garden, couldn't you tarry with me for an hour or something like that? This anxiety loop that we get into, and you can get tempted to, do repetitive prayers, but then you're guilty for being repetitive because God talks about don't be just repeating endless mantras. You're praying the same thing over and over. You're trying to get the wording right, make sure you're sincere. It's OCD. It's all OCD. And you're constantly checking. You're saying, am I spiritually safe? Am I okay? And it can be a source of guilt too, as you become more aware of theology, to say, but Christ paid it all. So I'm technically okay forever because this isn't a work salvation. So the fact that you feel like you're guilty and yet you know that Christ took all your guilt becomes another source of guilt because you're like, I'm not applying the gospel. The relief of the gospel can't come in a context where you feel constantly guilty. Guilty for sins, guilty for perceived sins, and guilty for not letting the gospel take away your sins. Everything at all. And if you have anything, extra again like that in your spiritual life, maybe you felt like God was being silent, like, God, I've prayed for your will and you're not answering. What did I do? Maybe he won't answer me because I've got a hidden sin in my heart. Maybe he won't answer me because I've got a hidden failure and impurity. Anything like that. You have to clear the slate. You have to clear the slate before God every day. And the whole advertisement of Christianity, in a sense, from an evangelical perspective, is We invite you to a personal relationship with God that is real, it's one-on-one, and it's intimate. And yet it's not. It's not intimate at all. It's intimate in the sense that it's in your head, but it's not intimate in the sense of safe and good. It's very much um, like you're on the chopping block. One little mistake and it's over. That stuff, for when you deal with that for years, it makes you afraid of yourself. It makes you afraid of your own mind. Everything from specific thoughts to just generically, I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid of the evidence of my random thoughts. I'm afraid of any images in my head. I'm afraid of course, directly blaspheming God, but I'm afraid of living a blasphemous life, whether it's through sexual thoughts or skeptical thoughts, anything. And I think for a lot of us, we would say that our childhood became, in a sense, a haunted house. You're scared. You're scared of what's in your head. You're scared of that place. You have to live there, but you're scared at the same time. And Christianity gives children a very strong sense of a moral panic, and you have no psychological tools and understanding to discern what an intrusive thought is. And some of the deepest wounds that we're going to deal with in this discovery process of working through deconstruction, and we're not deconstructing Christianity to reconstruct it, we're deconstructing Christianity so we can deconstruct ourselves and reconstruct ourselves. But for a lot of us, this is going to come down to, are you simply safe in your own body? And probably more importantly, are you safe in your own mind? Is your mind a place that's safe to exist? Or is it a battlefield? Is your body and your mind a battlefield? If you distrust your body and all of your physical longings and appetites and your emotions and instincts, and you're trying to teach yourself to restrain yourself and be suspicious of yourself and overly disciplined, just override everything you can. And if you're going to be inundated with this constant stuff at church of there's a spiritual world and a fleshly world, there's the dichotomies there. All this stuff, in bigger context of like modesty culture, purity culture, the culture, the Christian culture that I was in, of very much focusing on bodily discipline. Are you fasting? Are you in prayer enough? You learn to override anything that's self-preservation, and you learn to attack yourself, to empty yourself out. I mean, Paul talks in Philippians, that Christ poured himself out or emptied himself. You get this picture of like he's a pitcher of water, and the water is his divinity, and he could have held on to it and clung to it, and instead he poured it out. He didn't cling to it. Self sense of God. Let it go. Yourself go. Your humanness. Let it go. Pour it out for the sake of the witness. And a lot of us as adults, if we're really honest and we're really helping ourselves or getting help to dig through these things, you'd have to admit there are days you feel pretty numb. There are days I feel very numb. There are days I feel very disassociated. There are days I feel like I have trouble fully enjoying desires or reading my bodily cues. And it's all about, you are not at home in your own skin. You're not at home in your own mind. And we were putting adult theology, adult worldview stuff, adult constructs, and adult culture onto a child's heart, onto your heart and my heart. And you're pushing hell, depravity, righteousness, holiness. Again, God seeing everything, eternity hanging in the balance. These abstract topics that Christian adults talk about. And to us, it was terrifying, and it was very personal, even before we understood what it all meant. The sheer scale of these ideas and how they're going to overwhelm and, like a tsunami, just collide with a child's imagination. Hell is not a mild concept. Demons, eternal punishment, hellfire. These images that we carried, that we picture perhaps when you go to bed at night. You'd hear them in the stories, in the Bible books, in the songs, in the sermons. And adults are normalizing these doctrines, and it's all familiar to us. But there's this rawness, this immediacy, that the terrifying the floods, the plagues, the this, the that, the Ananias and Sapphira stuff, the wrath and the sacrifice, the atonement, the torment, the demonic possession. We're being taught directly and indirectly as children that the universe is basically structured around all these threats, internal and external, and that you are being watched. That's what this is all about. You're being watched and prepared for judgment. And what we would say to kids, we pass on to them and say, I'm just telling you the truth of the word of God. I think we need to argue that you are psychologically terrorizing children. And that's what happened to us. We felt ashamed and terrorized. And so we learned to hide. We learned to really, 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 really hide. We become very skilled at sort of picking up the cues as to what adults can see, because we want them to see the right version of us. We want to, like, what we might call testimony culture. I was sinful, but God came in and I got saved, and bam, I'm living for the Lord. And you narrate your life in this whole arranged, approved language. It became your second nature. And you lose track. You really lose track of what is real and what is genuine in your heart versus what is curated. You have curated a fake self. You pretend to be okay. You pretend to understand. You pretend to feel God. You pretend that you're spiritually thriving. And the issue is authenticity. And you feel more righteous and you feel better about yourself when you hide, when you conceal where you are with things. When authenticity becomes dangerous, you live a double life. And so many of us feel like we grew up as Christians living double lives, especially when sexuality came in, but even just the theology. Because to me, again, I didn't personally have really many outlets to dive into lust or anything I've even for sure, no one I would have gone and done something with. But my version of that maybe sexuality was more the immediate issue for other teens. My issue was the theology and feeling, am I authentically on fire for God or not? That was the affair, in a sense. That was the childhood, the young teen pregnancy concern of like, oh my goodness, those kids over there are worried about if they're going to get, have a pregnancy and have to confess before the church. I'm worried that someone's going to say, you don't really love God and you're really kind of living for yourself. That was my scandal. But it hurt a lot, just as much as everything else. And that ends up basically leaving you in a spot where you are just one bad thought away from a total breakdown and from a total rupture. And I think there's a couple side effects that I think I want to sort of wrap up with. One of them is that other people's love in the Christian world becomes a totally different thing that it probably should be and ever was meant to be. When you see Christians that just say, I care about you, I appreciate you, I love you, that should just be what it is at face value. But instead of that warm feeling, it always became an evaluation. It wasn't about resting in the acceptance or resting in the love. It became an issue of, this is a test and I hope I passed. And so love is tangled up in obedience. And again, when your approval rises because you do certain things at home or in church or at school, and then it falls when you're not, getting all the gold stars, love is about something you earn. It's not something you're given, you earn it. And that transcends your human relationships, of course, to your relationship with God, even though you live and breathe the evangelical message of it's by grace alone through faith alone. This is not a work salvation. You're effectively living out a work salvation. God loves you, but he's also angry. He's grieved. He's disappointed. He's testing you. He's disciplining you. And you may find, as you really dig down into the worldview level of your life, that when you look at your human relationships, you have to ask yourself, why does love feel so precarious? Why does human love, even after you've deconstructed or deconverted, why does love feel so dangerous? Why does it feel conditional? Why do I feel like I'm always under the microscope in a relationship? Now, that could be because you actually have a bad partner and they really are putting you under the microscope and they are really making you feel like one wrong move and they're going to, snap. That's different. But I'm talking about even in healthy relationships where love should not feel precarious, but it does. children need to have a secure attachment home and mentality and a secure social network. But when you have this shame-based stuff for years, it's going to offer an attachment based on your ability to pass these tests. To believe in a love that simply accepts you and stays when you're messy or, disorganized or confused or just human. You associate intimacy with being evaluated. You associate intimacy with being exposed. And the pain there it's traumatizing. And you can say to yourself, I am sure that Christianity is mythology and it is irrelevant. And you really mean it. You don't believe this stuff. You know it's garbage. You know it's bullshit. You know it's mythology that should have never had anything to do with your life. But despite that clear admission, and you mean it, you're honest, it's still driving your life because you associate intimacy with being evaluated and exposed. And that hurts. It hurts a lot. And this is why I say we are not just talking about beliefs. We're talking about worldview. Now, what do you believe that you can articulate? What do you really believe that you cannot easily articulate? And in these kind of contexts, we're talking about, again, unpacking this. But when you're looking back, and I think a lot of this is going to come back to put yourself back in your childhood. And I know it's like that can feel touchy-feely to a lot of us who grew up sort of saying touchy-feely, psychology is of the devil, or it's just, not good theology. But I think you need to find a way to get past that triggering, and I do too. But go back and say to yourself, I had a chance as a child to feel tenderness from other people and to feel tenderness toward myself, to give myself grace. And instead of being a child who got patience and guidance and love, you got turned into a little sinner, a little wretch who needed correction, and you needed to have your sin be something that you were always watching for, suspicious of. And so we need to invite ourselves at this point. Picture yourself, me, Tim, picture myself at age 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. What was the lens that we used and we taught ourselves, and we're taught, they did it to us, then we did it to ourselves. But what was the lens that we were taught to use as children when we looked at ourselves? Were you innocent? Were you okay? Or were you scared? Were you learning? Or were you overwhelmed? Were you curious about stuff and had a tender heart? Or were you morally bankrupt? It is heartbreaking beyond words to look back and realize that from the earliest days when you were just little, you were taught, judge yourself, judge yourself, judge yourself, judge yourself. You should not be gentle with yourself. Deal with sin. I remember many sermons about hacking Agag to pieces. King Saul was told, kill the Amalekites, all of them, animals, people, everybody, slaughter it. And he let the animals live, and he let King Agag live. And then Samuel, the priest, came and rebuked Saul. And it says, you did not obey God. And he took out a sword and he hacked King Agag to pieces in front of all the people to say, you will obey God and you will hack your sin to death. And they applied that to this is what Samuel had to do in the days of the Amalekites. This is what you do to your sin. You don't let it hang around and see if maybe there's a place for it. You hack your sin to death. That's not very gentle. And they drained your childhood of softness and kindness and grace. And your recovery and your grief at this point, and my recovery and my grief at this point, is to go back and to offer ourselves as children the understanding that no one gave us. There was so much innocence that we could have delighted in and been normalized in, but instead it was just danger, 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 danger. Not just around you, in your heart, you're dangerous. And that shame arguably follows us right into our adulthood. You can just walk through your adult patterns and trace them back to your early conditioning in religion as a child. maybe for some of you, it's just plain old people pleasing. You say sorry all the time. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you say that too much. Don't say sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for saying sorry so much. This perfectionism, that your inner world is defective, and we over apologize because we are chronically conditioned to feel guilty. We feel guilty just walking around. These are the emotional worldview reflexes that stay in our body, in our nervous system, in our psyche, and all these triggers are there. And when you look at the context of authority figures or criticism in your life, any conflict, sexuality, any uncertainty, trying to rest or being unable to, trying to enjoy pleasure or not being able to, any topics related to autonomy, just the shame keeps changing form. And you're not maybe saying to yourself, God is displeased with me. But you can still be saying, in a sense, to yourself, you're selfish, you're arrogant, you're too much, you're unsafe, you're dangerous, you're bad. And so our deconversions do not dissolve all that. They just don't. This is long-term, decades-long conditioning. That script is there. It's written in permanent ink. And we'll have to do our best to just scrub as much of it off of us as we can. Your intellect is not overriding your nervous system. Your intellect is not overriding your worldview. It's not. Your belief system and your worldview are two different things, and they're not talking to each other. Adulthood can become a place where your childhood shame finally comes out. It's like someone, just revealing the fullness of it all. It's like maybe you've trying to come up with a good example, but maybe you imagine somebody that's going to a restaurant and they know that they've only got $5 in their pocket, and they just keep ordering steak and filet mignon and this and that, and they order the lobster. And at some point the waiter's going to come out and give you the full bill and say, "This, you just ordered a $150 meal," and you feel like, oh my goodness, I've got $5. Adulthood is where this happens. Your shame comes out and the bill comes out, and you've got a lot to pay for. And that's what's happening here. And a lot of us feel so convicted, and we ask ourselves, how do I heal from this? How do I heal from this? From this relentless self-accusation that when we're younger, it felt like this is wisdom, this is maturity, this is good. But it's not. It's harm. It's self-harm. Attacking yourself and feeling constantly convicted is not evidence of the Holy Spirit. It's evidence of self-harm. And you have to say to yourself, I have never really learned the tools of how to protect my own self. And of course, others around you too. But first and foremost, when the mask comes out in the airplane, put your mask on first and help the person next to you. There's all these cracks in the system that we notice. But one of the biggest journeys parts of the journey is not just saying, I notice the cracks in the Christian system. It's saying, can I please weed through all of this stuff and get to a point where I say to myself, Tim, and say your own name in a sense here, self, where is my inner voice? I want to hear it, like, for real. I'm tired of thinking I know how I talk to myself. I think maybe I don't know how I talk to myself. And for the first time in my life, I want to know, where is my inner voice? And I think a lot of us will be ashamed and horrified to realize that our inner voice is one of absolute brutality. We talk brutally to ourselves. And we need to learn the difference between what they did to us and all the damaging stuff, and where we are now and where we could be. Because when you look at therapy and you look at learning the language of trauma, which is a big part, having the words to describe what happened to us, learning how to figure out how our nervous system was imprinted on and educated, it boils down really to just learning to love yourself and speak kindly to yourself. Be kind to yourself. And that feels so foreign to so many of us, because softness as a Christian was irresponsible. You can't be soft with sin. You can't be soft with wickedness and worldliness. But I think, it's time to say, this is shame. Shame is shame, and fear is fear. This is about trauma and anxiety. And we've wrapped up our whole identity in the language of church and the doctrine, the theology, the church culture. And it's time to pull back the layers of the onion and say, I admit it. I have lost years of my life to one simple issue. I have condemned myself from the earliest days. And that's a train that I got on as a kid, the self-condemnation train. Years later, I'm still in the train, and I've got a ticket to ride. And if I don't be careful, I will ride this train till the day I die. Healing begins when the child inside of you meets the adult inside of you today and says to the adult, you're like a screaming mob. You're a screaming mob at yourself. You're holding up signs, you're screaming, you're punching, you're a mob that's ready to beat yourself up. It's assaulting yourself. You're ashamed of yourself. And to say, I'm tired of doing that. And it's like your adult self can go back to your childhood self and say, I will protect you from the mob. And that mob in some ways is the church, it's Christianity, but in some ways that mob is me. We have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. As the quote goes. I wish so much for myself and for you that we can identify shame culture. And I think we often think shame culture equals, purity culture equals thoughts about sex. I would argue that for a lot of us, it's so deeper. It's sex is one piece of the puzzle, and perhaps a big piece for some of us, but it's much more profound and it's much more basic. You just straight up hate yourself. And I think a lot of us could trace so many of our character traits and our personality traits that we developed over the years and our habits as 100 little forms of trying to say to yourself, you're okay. And if we could finally weed through it and see ourselves, we'd say, I see myself for the first time. And if I could picture it and say it this way metaphorically, you meet yourself for the first time and you say, I finally met my 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old self. And that child, when I finally saw them for real, it's a little child crying in the dark. It's a little child crying in the dark. That's you. That's me. We're just children crying in the dark, saying, will someone please stop this nightmare? And if you don't stop it, again, it will be the driving factor. It will punch the buttons. If you've seen that movie, the movies from Disney, Inside Out, you have this control room, and they've got all the levers and the buttons. And if you're not careful, they will keep pushing those buttons, and you will not know they're there, but they will keep pushing them. Healing from religious trauma is not just saying Christianity's mythology. It's going back to your 5-year-old self and beyond and figuring out a way to give yourself the biggest restart and the biggest hug and the biggest cry of your life. I was a little bit more generic and a little bit more metaphorical than I meant to be. I meant to share more of my story, but I think this still worked out. I've woven shame into some other topics too, so I don't feel too bad, but I hope some of this helps you to think through it. And I hope you'll be willing to take a second look at what you do today, especially in relationships, and say, how am I using relationships to find a way to silence the nightmares and the screams? So anyway, I'm going to read a few comments here, and then we'll wrap up here. I've gone for a while here, but I appreciate you all reading comments or writing comments and leaving them for me here while I sort of went through all that. Let's see here. You cannot rest in your own room. Yeah, your own mind. Trained to live in a paranoid nightmare. Yep. I've always wondered what I did that was so bad that I needed to be saved. Why was I going to hell though as I was a good child? Yeah, absolutely. It's like, why am I so bad? But then you feel guilty for asking that because the Bible says, you're born in sin. You're born as a sinner. It's like you've got this weight on you that you can't feel, and you feel ashamed that you can't feel the weight. Praise is truly a trap. It's a cheap substitute for the shame and self-hatred. Yeah, it really is. And yet it becomes addicting. Guilty for feeling guilty. Facts. I was raised a Christian, but was never afraid of my thoughts. I was basically evil. Now my brain is diseased with crap of my old past self, but I'm able to know what I am myself in my brain. Yeah. It's so important to at least try. All we can do is try to figure out how this affected us. William, great to see you here. I'm so glad I can catch this live. Thanks so much. And thank you very much. Appreciate you being here. It means the world to me to have people join me in this journey. Christianity is madness. Yeah, it really is. We feel guilty just for walking around. Yes, after I deconverted, I felt something shift in me in the store. Why do I feel like I'm in everyone's way? I have a right to take up space too. Yeah, it sounds silly to put it that way, but that's it. Emotionally, in some ways, that's it. You feel guilty that you're taking up space. It's so profound to be able to admit that and to try to figure out why am I like that's. But that's the belief versus worldview. You can believe I have every right as anyone else to be here. I have very little to apologize for in life, but your inside is saying, "Oh, excuse me, pardon me, I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. I did it again. Oh, I'm so ashamed of myself." And it's your inner voice. Your inner voice has the access to the buttons. Your belief system does not. And until we get that, it's not gonna change. My inner voice became the voice of my bullies because I heard how much the Christians around me, because I heard how much the Christians around me so hated gay people. I knew I had to hide myself away in order to be loved and accepted. Yeah. And that's one of the hardest, saddest parts is when the theology gets very specific. It's not just generically we're all sinners. It's you specifically have something that should have a scarlet letter. It's very, very difficult for people to think through. And that's why, honestly, a lot of people just kind of fall through the cracks. And it's like, that's not them becoming worldly or not being serious about God. There are gay people that really want to worship God and go to church, and they're not looking to deconstruct Christianity. They just wish they could be part of the community, but they feel like they cannot because of their shame. John, thank you so much for being here and listening. I really appreciate it. John is one of the people that supports my channel as well through the memberships. John, I appreciate you being a YouTube member. And I had several people in the last 2 or 3 days become YouTube members. It's not in the comments here today, but someone did become yesterday. I appreciate your support so much. I really do. And William, yep, absolutely. I just want to ditto that and give everybody a big hug. I know some of these topics might feel more intellectual to you, but for some people, probably, especially if you have the privacy, but even if you're just doing something else, it might still sort of bring an invisible tear to your eye to think about the fact that some of these things really are truisms. Maybe you're already fully dealing with it, and I'm just reminding you of stuff that's already front and center in your mind. But whether this is stuff you already consider all the time or stuff you're just thinking through for the first time, I do hope it helps. I do want to see us as a community hopefully migrate past the idea that if we've academically deconstructed and deconverted from Christianity, that therefore we've done the hard work. We have only opened the floodgates to the hard work, which is deconstructing and reconstructing ourselves. That's what this is leading to. The academics is great. You can't not do this without that. You can't do this without that. But if you've said Christianity's mythology, you're only starting stage 1 of 1,000. And I think so many of us get tempted to think, yeah, no, if we deconverted from Christianity, we've done, if there's 1,000 steps, we've jumped through 950 of those steps. No, you've jumped through 1 or 2 or 3 maybe, but there's still 1,000 of those steps left. And it's mostly about your inner voice. It's mostly about your inner child. It's mostly about your self-talk. It's about your headspace. It's about your worldview. So please keep joining me when you can on these. I love the feedback. We do have tonight a live stream at 8 o'clock Eastern. It's hoping, fingers crossed. Tonight's topic is going to be, how did the Christian obsession with suffering affect you? And that is not to say the suffering of Christ, not this obsession with Christ's suffering, though that's a piece of the puzzle. But how did the Christian obsession with you suffering as a Christian, meaning suffering for God's glory, suffering as a means of Him disciplining you, suffering simply as a way of saying, I can suffer graciously under pressure because of God, suffering as a witness, as a form of evangelism, suffering as a way of God refining the fire. How did that Christian obsession with your suffering as part of your sanctification process, how did that affect you? So if you can join us tonight for that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. That's a call in, open mic. So I'll do a little talking to kick us off and to wrap us up. But hopefully some people will share their stories. But thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to wrap it up here and we'll pick it up tonight. And again, if anyone can support me, all the ways to do so beneath this video. I'm aiming to get up to 3, 4, even 5 live streams a day. Some of it will start even next week to that cadence. But I do need your support and your help to do it if I can. And hopefully this is also the kind of thing that not just helps me to keep going, but also just the help. And if I can use the word blessing, I know that could trigger some people, but if we can all be a blessing to each other through these discussions, I think it's an endeavor that's worth trying for. So thank you all so much. I'll talk to you in a few hours. Have a wonderful day. Thanks again.